John Hook's Newsmaker starts now.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker. Later in the program, we're going to spend some time remembering legendary Suns broadcaster Al McCoy, who passed away last weekend at 91. Longtime Suns broadcaster Tom Leander will join me later in the program to remember the late, great Al McCoy. But first, we're going to take a little detour, and I mean detour, with an expert on everything roads and driving. After all, we've got over 5 million licensed drivers in Arizona, and it seems that we're on a never-ending cycle of road expansion and road construction. So with that, I want to bring on internet sensation, road guy Rob. Rob, thank you.
You're too kind. I'm not an expert, but I'm not afraid to talk to an expert to find out how this stuff works.
That's sometimes more important. Okay, first of all, I know you've spent time in Phoenix. Why? People ask me all the time, why don't we just build the road to 6 lanes the first time? Why do we do 3 and then 10 years later add 3 more?
Right. Well, because I can see the frustration, but it really comes down to the big picture money, right? You have only so much money to go around. I mean, Maricopa County has a list that's literally 30 years into the future of planning out, okay, this is how much tax revenue we're getting from that sales tax and gas tax money. And so if we build the freeway bigger than it needs to be now, that comes at a cost. Maybe the road costs twice as much. Well, then there's, a project on the other side of Phoenix in the other part of the valley that doesn't get done because we spent all the money overbuilding a certain area.
That didn't
and then
need
when
it.
You put
yes,
sorry.
Yes, that didn't need it at the time. So
right.
You've got to move people, so it's like, let's move them, even if it's not the max. We'll move them, get that done, and we'll expand later. That's the rationale.
Right, because there's also requirements in law that they spend the money as fairly and equally as they can, because we all contribute to that sales tax revenue, but they can't like all go to one neighborhood, right? And so that's the other part of it too, is you say I live, if I lived in Phoenix and I lived off like the 51, right? Oh, spare no expense to make the 51 fantastic. But then when somebody lives out by the 202, they're like, well, wait a minute. We've been waiting for this improvement, and you're getting it up by the 51.
Exactly. Okay, since you've been in Phoenix, just give me a grade on the Phoenix freeway system. Is it better than we think it is?
It is better than you think it is if you own a car. So Phoenix is challenging to get around for the percentage of people in Arizona who can't drive because they're too young or too old or have a health issue. Maybe they just don't like to drive. But for those of us who are road guys that get behind the wheel, for motorists, it's excellent. And a lot of it's because it's so modern. It got built so much later than most cities. It wasn't built in the 60s. It was built in the 90s.
Yes. And you know what? Actually, I do think we have a pretty good road system. I think us in Texas have a pretty darn good road system. All right, I'm going to ask you about a couple of things. I've got a couple of pet peeves.
Okay.
We may differ on this, but you know that downtown Phoenix has been very big on converting streets to bike lanes, adding bike lanes.
Right.
Now, Rob, I see very few people using them, particularly when it gets over 95 degrees. So I'm wondering why we're squeezing traffic and arteries to accommodate a very low number of bicyclists.
Well, part of it is if you think about, to imagine for a moment the road network and picture that big grid. You got all the mile blocks and all the neighborhood streets connected together and all the freeways. But imagine, and okay, now imagine a map of all the bike lanes, right? And it's like one here, and this one's not connected to this one. If your car map looked like your bike lane map, would you drive a car? You know what I mean? Because you can't get anywhere because the roads don't go anywhere.
Okay, so is it a wise use of dollars to do this?
Absolutely, because over time, there's this whole middle segment of transportation that's emerging now with the electric scooters and the e-bikes that didn't exist 10 plus years ago. So I think a lot of planning and transportation was, okay, well, you have the sidewalks for people who walk and the car lanes for the cars, and you're done. And creating space for this middle group of users, many of whom, can take advantage of, for instance, they take the Valley Rail somewhere. There's higher density development on that rail. Well, those are people who might have been, if that hadn't been there, would be living way out, like say the Santan Valley, and then putting traffic on the roads, driving tons of miles. Well, their journey is really short now because they can go from their apartment to like the train and then maybe the train a mile to work. How do they get there? Well, they're that middle group of users who need space. They're like too slow to be in the car lanes, but too fast to be on the sidewalk.
This is the city core idea, having a city core with commerce and everything and residential and everything down there. Yeah. And we're kind of getting there in downtown Phoenix. All right, roundabouts, love them or hate them?
As of last year, I love them now.
I do too. I absolutely love them.
Well, what happens, most cities, they'll put one roundabout in and it's kind of like a toy. And it's like, okay, well, that's neat. But think about these big streets in Phoenix, right? Where you're on a big 7-lane street and you all come to a red light and a big group of cars all builds up, right? And then the light turns green and then there's like a big group you take off. But then behind you, the road's pretty empty. And so it's like we only use our big roads half the time because of that push-pull of the stoplights.
Yes.
It's the nature of a stoplight. But roundabouts just charge randomly. Cars arrive at random times, they leave at random times. And so you can move the same amount of traffic on a big road does that's in use half the time. A roundabout street, instead of being 3 lanes wide in each way, could be 2 lanes each way.
Let me ask you, yeah, and I agree. And they adopted this in Scottsdale. That's where I live. And it was kind of weird at first, but once people got used to it, you keep moving, which is great for reducing particulates, air pollution, all of that. So.
Well, and a lot of it is they say, oh, well, this is a thing to like help the bicyclists and people walking or whatever, which is true because you're not having to sit and wait at a long red light. You don't go 50 miles an hour, stop. 50 miles an hour stop. You could do 30 and then go through and 30 go through and still get to where you want to go faster than the 50 mile an hour stop, 50 mile an hour stop. Yep. So people walking down the street, that's less stressful. People riding their bike, that's less stressful. You go to Carmel, Indiana. If you're ever visiting the Midwest, you go to Carmel, Indiana. They took out every stoplight and made every single stoplight a roundabout.
I saw that on one of your posts on YouTube.
You never stop.
Yes.
To drive around. It is the most just like happy place to drive a car I've ever seen.
Let me ask you about, I-17 here in Arizona, heading up to Flagstaff. We're building these flex lanes that they'll move them to where they need them, going either north or south. What do you think about that idea?
Those work really well in areas where you have unbalanced traffic, right? So like I live near Los Angeles, so all the freeways are busy in every direction all the time. And there are valley freeways that are that way too, where you go to rush hour, it's bumper to bumper in both directions. But think about that end of the North Valley as you're going up toward Flagstaff. Well, it's going to be balanced based, going one way in the morning and one way in the afternoon. So they could spend a lot of money. Arizona DOT could spend a lot of money widening both sides of the freeway.
Let me ask you about reversible lanes. We've got them in downtown Phoenix, kind of in, where we reverse lanes going back north on the rush hour in the evening. We have them the opposite way in the morning. Do you think that's a good or bad idea or a recipe for disaster?
Well, I wouldn't call it a recipe for disaster, but it does get a little scarier on the city streets, right? Because on the freeway, you move a barrier back and forth. Freeways have tight access control. They limit with concrete where you can get on and off. You have to use an off-ramp. You ever notice there's no driveways on a freeway? That's why we can drive so fast on them. A city street has business driveways, sometimes house driveways, and on the big Phoenix streets, they put a big median in the middle to limit that, so you're not making weird left turns in places that can cause crashes. But on a flex lane street, well, it gets kind of hard to put a median in because you can't, you know what I mean?
Yes.
By nature,
yep.
It's the reversible lane uses the whole street, so then people start making left turns.
Yep.
And so you combine the fact that people are already a little bit stressed out trying to figure out what lanes are acceptable for them to be driving in, and if one of them's a turn lane, and then if so, you're driving down the street, well, is that a stalled car or is that a car waiting to turn left? Again, I wouldn't call it a disaster because I think they work really hard with lights and markings to try to make it as safe as they can.
Yeah.
But
you have to have some local knowledge, though. Hey, we've got 30 seconds. Red light cameras and speed cameras. Good or bad idea?
If cities owned them, they probably could work well, but because of the contracts that they're involved in, it creates a moral hazard where the camera companies encourage cities to put cameras in areas where they don't fix the problem, because if you fix the problem, the camera doesn't make any money.
Oh my God, you just read one of my stories from many years ago where we crunched the data and found out they were putting the stuff in locations that made money rather than save lives. So yes, thank you for that. I appreciate it. All right, you can find Road Guy Rob on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Patreon, which I'm not familiar with, but I think you get paid on that one, so good luck on that.
Thanks, Chad.
Rob, thank you. Road Guy Rob. All right. Coming up next, Phoenix Suns broadcaster Tom Leander will join me to remember legendary Phoenix Suns play-by-play giant, Al McCoy. Back in a minute. Welcome back on Newsmaker. We lost a legend this past week as veteran broadcaster Al McCoy, voice of the Phoenix Suns for 51 years, passed away at age 91. And we wanted to take a few moments to savor what was an incredible life and career of Al McCoy, who became the soundtrack of so many incredible moments in Suns history. Tom Leander shared a bunch of those, 11 seasons calling play-by-play for the Suns broadcasts on TV, 25 seasons hosting pregame and postgame shows. Tom Leander joins me now on Newsmaker. Tommy, great to see you.
And John, it's always great to see you. You are a legend in my mind, and we go back so many years, back to our days in Tucson.
I'm a legend in my own mind. That's the
I'm
problem.
sure in the kids, Gina's.
No, you know, the kids are a great leveler on all that stuff.
Yeah, for
Tommy,
sure.
Al McCoy, what a prince, what a great guy. When you think of Al and what he contributed to the Valley, to the Suns, and you knew him personally as well, what comes to mind?
You know, I think he just, his status in the community and what he represented for the Suns organization as a broadcaster is what always thrilled me, being around him, because I grew up like everybody else here in Phoenix, listening to him, watching him. And as a ball boy for the Phoenix Suns, I helped set up the press table for Al and Stan Richards, who was a public address announcer. And then for years later to be working basically side by side with Al is just, it's been a dream come true. But you know, he taught me a lot of things, John. He taught me that you don't have to be over 6 feet to have a long NBA career. And he also taught me not to take myself too seriously. I mean, we had a lot of fun with Al too. As much of a professional as he was, he would go out and have fun. We did this Suns Undercover with hidden cameras, and we had him working the drive-through window at McDonald's. And you know, people would drive up and he'd, Shazam, what would you like today? You know, so it was, you know, I saw all the different sides of Al McCoy, and those are all the things that I'll take with me.
Tommy, what is it about Midwesterners and broadcasting? He came from Iowa, grew up on a farm, and he was listening to games. He was listening to some of the greats, Harry Carey and the others, and it really kind of molded him. But there's something about that Midwestern sensibility, which we know is a big component of what makes Arizona special as well, because we've got so many transplants. But that's part of that's part of the DNA that came across on the broadcast.
I know, you could just picture him as a kid sitting on the front porch listening to baseball games and then starting to call them himself. And I think that's another reason why, John, and I'm glad you brought this up too, because I think so many of us aspire to go big, go national, work in New York, you know, work in the big markets for some of the national outlets. Another thing that Al taught me was, you know, it can be a lot of fun and very endearing, and have a lot of gratitude from your fans by staying in a market like Phoenix. I mean, it's turned into a big city, but you know, you talk about being a big fish in a small pond. I think you can actually develop deeper bonds with your fans that way, and that's certainly what happened to Al. I mean, for sure, Al could have gone on to work nationally, but you know, he started here in Phoenix when it was a small town in the 70s, and he stayed here 51 years, and I'm sure he had many opportunities. And I remember he filled in on TNT a couple of times, but it was something that I saw and I really admired. And I love being here in Phoenix and working in television here. And I had my big aspirations. I wanted to work, if Ernie Johnson was going to take the night off on TNT, and work with Charles and Kenny and Shaq, and it never happened. But I didn't really need that because I watched Al, and I have the same sort of, I think, acceptance in my own mind about my career,
Yeah.
and developing the bonds here. I mean, it's really cool to be a Suns announcer and to be, working alongside Al, because most of the people are like, "Hey, tell Al McCoy I say hello, and I'm a big fan." I'm sure I'll pass that along.
All right, Tommy, some of the catchphrases: Shazam, whammo, oh brother, Heartbreak Hotel, put it in the deep freeze. I mean, it goes on and on. He could craft that phrase, and it became trademarks for him.
And John, I kept a glossary of all of those trademarks of his. So growing up, I listened to it. We all were just thrilled. I mean, he could just describe the game, and with those catchphrases, his enthusiasm. And then I went to college in Los Angeles, and so I got to listen to Chick Hearn. I mean, there's another guy who has all the great catchphrases. And when you think about the game of basketball and the job of being a play-by-play announcer, I mean, it's really dribble, catch, shoot, play defense, but it's the guys that can describe it in so many different ways and be so creative. And I literally have a glossary of the different terms and ways to describe the different actions on a basketball court by Al McCoy and Chick Hearn. Wow. So when I started doing play-by-play, I tried to develop my own, and they were nowhere near as good, and I probably tried too hard and tried to force them in there. But, I was a product of who I watched growing up, listened to growing up, and revered.
Yeah, and that's the part of Pay It Forward that Al McCoy was really generous about that. And you guys, because of a business decision made by the Suns, they kind of separated the broadcast. I'm trying to remember what year. You'll know because you had to come in and take over the TV side, and Al remained on the radio side. Now that typically could create friction. But I want you to describe your interaction with Al when that decision was made and you were not replacing him, but you were taking that spot. And that's a ticklish spot to be in.
Yeah, it sure was. It was 2002, and then President Rick Welts called me across the street for lunch and said, "Hey, we'd like to offer you the road games on television because we're going to end the simulcast." And so I knew exactly what that meant for Al McCoy. And I even told Rick, I'm like, "Rick, is Al okay with this? I mean, I'm not okay if Al's not okay. And I know the fans are not going to be okay with it, certainly in the beginning." And sure enough, about 2 days later, I got a phone call, and it was Al McCoy, and he said, "Hey, can you come on up to my office? I'd like to talk to you." And I'm like, "Oh, sure." But I knew. I mean, Al's a professional. He's a wonderful human being. I knew it wasn't going to be contentious. And if it was anything but, I mean, he basically just looked at me. He said, "Tom, take a seat." He goes, "This is your time. It's your turn." And man, that just, I became pretty emotional, and Al was just so good about it. And from that day forward, it never was that kind of sticky situation that it could have become. And Al, I think, really, he's to this day, to his final day of broadcasting, he loved radio. And he talked about it in his last broadcast, too. He said, "I want to thank all the sight impaired out there for allowing me to describe the games to you."
I remember this.
And that meant so much to him.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of the power of radio, too. So he knew that he still held that power and was still going to talk to that audience.
Tommy, he's in the Ring of Honor. I think he was the 12th inductee for the Suns. But he's also in the Naismith Pro Basketball Hall of Fame on the broadcast side, of course. That's a big, big deal. That is rare company that accomplishes that.
And to be recognized again as a local broadcaster by the Basketball Hall of Fame, the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame, it doesn't get any better than that. And that's another thing, being able to travel with him. And even when I see some of the national TV guys come into town, Mike Breen, Mike Tirico, Dave Pash, who lives here, I mean, they go straight to Al and they talk to him. They have so much respect for him as a person and his broadcasting career, continuing to broadcast for 51 years. That's insane. I mean, it doesn't happen unless really you're Vin Scully. But the respect that he has from all the national broadcasters, and then beyond that, John, in this business too, it's really great to be recognized by your peers. But in the world of sports, if you're also respected and admired by players and coaches, And you think about how Devin Booker has reached out to Al McCoy. There's some beautiful pictures of the two of them together. I mean, that's something that stands out. And his final public appearance just a few months ago, he introduced Mike Budenholzer, our new head coach, who grew up in Holbrook. This was a thrill for Budenholzer to have Al McCoy introducing him, and he embraced Al McCoy with something I get all choked up about. I mean, that picture, and I tweeted that out because it was the first thing I thought of. I'm like, man, that was Al's final public appearance, and here's a head coach who grew up in Arizona who embraces him. And I said that was a hug that was taken to heaven.
Yeah, and he got down on one knee, kind of like, I'm not worthy. That's how much respect Budenholzer has for Al McCoy.
Yeah, no question. And Al continues to be a presence in my life. Yesterday, my phone rang and I looked at it and it said Dick Van Arsdale. I'm like, oh my gosh, Dick Van Arsdale's calling me. And, Dick and I go back a long ways,
Sure.
but I hadn't talked to him in a while. And then, Todd Walsh. Todd Walsh
Yes.
texted me last night. Paul Coro, the former Suns beat writer. These are just a few of the people that I have reconnected with in the last 48 hours because of Al McCoy. So he's pulling some strings up in heaven. Zingo those strings.
Right. Tommy, greatest calls that he made. Obviously, the shot heard around the world in the 76 against the Celtics. That would be right up there, but also that triple overtime, Barkley and Jordan in 93. I mean, there are some unbelievable moments.
Rex Chapman,
yes,
hitting that fadeaway three-pointer in the playoffs against Seattle. Unfortunately, we didn't win that game. That's one of my favorite calls. And then Marley sank like a 50-footer against the Lakers. I mean, there's so many. I mean, all the power dunks by Amari Stoudemire too. And it'd be difficult to pick one, but when you talk about the magnitude of the game and the setting, even though there weren't as many viewers back then, but yeah, that shot heard around the world. And he was, he tells that story about how he's just crammed in, surrounded by all these Celtic fans who started drinking like 3 or 4 hours before the game, and he had a fan pass out in his lap during the course of that game, and he's still able to make that magical call.
Yeah, and you and I both know Dan Hicks, of course, because we work with Dan in Tucson, who's now on NBC calling golf and swimming and skiing. Dan's a dear friend, and Dan told me, when he got there, he said, the key thing is to try to stay calm in big, big moments, to not get ahead of yourself, try to keep your composure, and don't speed up and breathe. You've got to keep it under control. He was talking about the Ryder Cup. Calling that when Leonard made that enormous putt, he said, you have to somehow gather yourself, and Al was a master at that.
Yeah. I just wish Dan would have called me too and let me know about some of those tips. I would have been a lot better at it. But it's so true, and Al is so comfortable. And obviously the experience that he has and had for all those big calls. But when you met him, he was not a tall guy,
No.
but he carried himself with such a presence and such confidence. I mean, that's something, my confidence can waver from, day to day. And Al just was so solid. And that was the way his broadcast came across. I mean, he never was overwhelmed by the moment. He cherished them, and he basically rose to the occasion every time he had one.
One more thing, Tommy, what do you take from your life experience with Al McCoy? What do you take for Tom Leander?
I'm just blessed. I'm blessed that we were on a first name basis. I'm blessed that I got to work with him. Heck, I actually was his analyst for a preseason game in Houston years ago, and I still don't know why the Suns sent me. Like, Al McCoy needs a color analyst? Like, it didn't need me, but I got a chance to sit next to him and try to figure out how to be an analyst. That was never my position, and just realize, just get out of the way. And Al was just so patient with me. And, I think back about, again, that time that you talked about when there was that transition and how he handled it. So I've taken so many different things from him, but more than anything, the memories as a kid growing up and being a huge basketball fan. I idolized Paul Westphal and Alvin Adams and Walter Davis, and Al was the one who brought them to life for me.
Yeah, very rarely does a broadcaster end up being such a seminal part of a franchise, but he was, and we will miss him. Tommy Leander, great to see you, buddy. I appreciate your time.
Always great to see you, John. You're the best, man.
Thanks, man. Tom Leander. We're back in a minute on Newsmaker. Thanks to Road Guy Rob and, of course, old friend Tom Leander, remembering the late Al McCoy. We will see you next week on Newsmaker.